on the trails. So that's it. So take it away.
Thanks, Ellen. Appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to start with the main presentation here. Just a reminder about a few sort of Zoom good practices. So it's a good habit. Keep yourself muted, unless you're about to ask a question, of course, during the question and discussion portion. Also, please keep your video turned off, especially if you're planning to move around, because it can be quite distracting for everybody else. If you do have your video on and you want to ask a question, you can do the wave your hand thing, or you can use the feature within Zoom to raise a virtual hand. Or you can just put it right in the chat, and we'll be going through that at the end of the presentation to cover those off. I think that's it for best practices. So now, as both a TFN member and a zoo volunteer on both, I'm really delighted to introduce today's speaker, Rachelle Fortier. She is the Species Recovery Branch Coordinator at the Toronto Zoo. Rachelle has a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental and Resource Science and Geography from Trent, and a Master of Science degree in Biology from McMaster. She has a passion and love for wetland species and ecosystems, working closely with reptiles and amphibians, especially turtles, in recent years. In her role as a coordinator, she assists with the execution of the Toronto Zoo's species recovery programming, including the Adopt a Pond Wetland Conservation Program, which leads the Blandings Turtle Head Start project. In this talk, Rachelle will highlight the work being done to recover Blandings turtles in the Rouge National Urban Park through the headstarting efforts, while also sharing some of the other amazing species recovery projects working to conserve Ontario's species at risk. With that, I will turn it over to you, Rachelle, and at the end of your presentation, of course, we'll come back and then we'll go through the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I will get this all up and going.
Get out of the way.
Let's see. Okay, we should be good to go. I can't see anybody, so if there's any problems or anything throughout, please just unmute and yell at me. But thank you so much, Robert, for that wonderful introduction. Yes, like mentioned, my name is Rachelle, I'm Species Recovery Coordinator at the Toronto Zoo, helping with a lot of our conservation programming related to native species here in Ontario. I'll also go over a little bit what that means in a few slides. But our main focus today is to talk about the Blandings Turtle Head Start project, which is one of our major projects that we're doing to help work to conserve the Blandings turtle population that lives in our own backyards right here in the Rouge River watershed in Rouge National Urban Park. Very similar to the land acknowledgement that was already given. We like to acknowledge the land that we are on at the Toronto Zoo and the land where most of the conservation work that we're going to speak about today occurs is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that the Toronto Zoo is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And what was slightly mentioned before we started, so anybody who hopped on the call early already got a little bit of a tidbit. For those of you who don't know, today is World Wetland Day, which is a super important day and very timely for this presentation. As unfortunately a lot of the wetlands globally, but especially here in Ontario, are imperiled. And we've unfortunately lost over 70% of the wetlands that originally occurred, especially here in Southern Ontario. Northern Ontario is a little bit of a different situation. But here in Southern Ontario, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of wetlands. And in the GTA specifically, it's upwards of 90% of the wetlands that naturally occurred. And for wetlands, that's a huge issue. Wetlands take thousands of years to develop. They're home to so many different species. They're one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. And for the species that we're going to be talking about today, the Blandings turtles, wetlands are essential for their persistence and their presence here in Ontario. And without wetlands, we won't be able to have Blandings turtles. So super important to acknowledge their importance today. Take some time to learn a little bit more about wetlands, which you guys are doing here today, and also share what you know about wetlands and the importance of them with the people around you. They're not only important for the animals and species that live there at an ecological level, but also provide immense ecosystem services for us as well, including water filtration, water storage, carbon storage, and helping us prevent against some of the dramatic flooding and things that we've seen recently. If we have more wetlands, those impacts will be reduced as well. So just important thing to keep back your head as we're talking today. Yeah, happy World Wetland Day. So just to start us off a little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about the conservation science work that happens at your Toronto Zoo. As already mentioned, I work with the species recovery branch, which is focused in what we call in situ conservation. So working to conserve the species right where they live out in the wild. We often like to say that we help protect the species that live in our own backyards. Some of the programming that occurs within the species recovery branch are the Great Lakes Conservation Program, which is very focused on education around freshwater or aquatic species at risk, with that being defined more as like fish and also freshwater mussels. We also have a bat conservation program at the Toronto Zoo that is working to just learn more about native bat species here in Ontario, much more cryptic species that a lot of people don't know much about and unfortunately don't have as much scientific knowledge about the bats that live right here in Ontario, especially the ones that are living in more remote places like the far north. So working really hard to do some science and monitoring of these species and specific populations in order to learn more about them to help their overall conservation. And then with the Adopt a Pond Wetland Conservation Program, working really heavily with the Blandings turtles, especially the ones that are living in Rouge National Urban Park, trying to reestablish population there, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but also worked really hard with outreach and education related to reptiles and amphibians in Ontario. Again, some of those lesser known species that are imperiled, and so just trying to work more to teach people more about them. But what zoos and what zoos are a little bit more known for is what we call ex situ conservation. So being a place for species conservation outside of their wild habitats and wild areas. And so we have a lot of amazing science that happens at the Toronto Zoo related to that. And zoos are very well known for being very important in terms of wildlife conservation, and especially in preserving genetics and maintaining populations of species that may be critically endangered or even extinct already out in the wild. And so we have really amazing programming, like our really amazing departments at the Toronto Zoo that work to help protect species in kind of all these different ways, including our reproductive science team. Again, really working hard for maintaining and looking at genetic diversity and maintaining biological material through biobanking of these much more critically endangered species to help them with their conservation in the future. We have our wildlife health team and our nutrition team and our welfare science teams that all work to maintain the health and well-being of the animals that live right here at your Toronto Zoo. And then also some other programming similar to kind of what we're doing with at the species recovery branch, but with some breeding and reintroduction projects and programs that are kind of working on the back end of species conservation in terms of having these breeding programs for then the future release and reintroduction of these species into the wild. Some examples I have here on the slide are black-footed ferret and our eastern Massasauga rattlesnake projects. So just a little bit of highlight of all the different kind of sciences that happen at your Toronto Zoo, and we're going to talk a little bit more, obviously, about one of those in situ projects through the Blandings Turtle Headstarting project. And before we get into specifics about the project, I just kind of want to set the scene a little bit for why we're doing what we're doing and with the Headstarting turtles. And for those of you who don't know, all 8 species of turtles that live right here in Ontario are at the federal level, or what we call at risk, which means that something's happening to their populations. They're declining in numbers and have been for some time, where we're starting to see noticeable changes in their overall population levels, typically caused or most frequently caused by anthropogenic stressors and things that humans are doing. And the Blanding's turtle is kind of one of those key focal species. It's listed as threatened here in Ontario, but at the federal level in Canada is listed as endangered. And it is one of those species that is a little very interconnecting all these other species that we have, many of them living in very different types of habitats and very different ranges across Ontario. The Blanding's turtle is kind of one of those species that often uses at some point in their life all these different kinds of habitats, and is a little bit more of an indicator of biodiversity, and able to be something that we often refer to as like almost an indicator species, and be able to be used as a species where their protection therefore will also protect other species, including all these other turtles, but also other wetland obligate species that live there. So these turtles, especially here in Ontario, are at risk for a few different reasons. Some of these many of you may already know, but the kind of key things that are leading to their decline at the species and population levels, the biggest thing is habitat loss. This is, key for almost all species that are what we classify as species at risk. Losing the places that they live has resulted in significant population declines for many different species, and turtles are no different. As already mentioned, because of World Wetland Day, we've lost over 70% of the wetland habitat here in Southern Ontario, which almost all of these species rely on for all life stages. So without the habitat they need to live, it's really hard for these individuals and these species to thrive. And not only habitat loss, but also habitat fragmentation. So the breaking up of these once large, big interconnected wetland systems now into much smaller portions, typically by roads. And this has led to changes or restrictions in these animals' movement, which is really essential for most of these turtle species that we have here in Ontario. They need to move typically quite far ways to find the essential habitat. So places to nest, to find mates, to find their overwintering habitat, which now also means that they're having to get up and cross roads in order to do that. And unfortunately, thousands of turtles are being hit on roads every year in Ontario. And due to some of their life history characteristics, like they're often what we call long-lived species. So some of these turtle species, especially our larger ones, live anywhere from 80, 90 to 100 years or older, but also don't reach sexual maturity typically until they're a little bit older, which is different than a lot of other species. So even upwards of 10 years or older until they're reaching sexual maturity, is then meaning that every time that these individuals are killed or hit by cars on the road, it's taking a really, really long time to replace them in the population. And the kind of big stat that we often hear or refer to is that typically, for example, with snapping turtles, as pictured here, it takes about 60 years to replace an adult female that is hit by a car on the road and dies, because of all of those other life history traits, without really taking into account all these other stresses that they're also facing. So really, really key thing to understand when looking at why turtles are at risk here in Ontario. As I kind of mentioned as well, is that very few, or they have long late maturing. So they don't start maturing until they're 10, 15, 20 years old in some cases. But unfortunately, even at that, or even with that in mind, they also have very low hatchling or juvenile survival. Many eggs and nests are dug up sometimes almost immediately, especially in urban areas where there's a lot more or higher density of predators that might dig up turtle nests, like raccoons, foxes, minks, things like that. But also the juveniles have very high mortality rates or very low survival rates as well. Lots of different things eat turtles, especially when they're small. When they hatch, they're about the size of a toonie or a loony. And so there's lots of things that could potentially want to eat them, including fish, birds, even bigger turtles. And as they get older, those those mortality rates start to decrease as they get a little bit bigger. But still major threats, especially when we have a lot more of those predators like raccoons in areas that are much more likely to eat larger turtles than some of their maybe predators that they would have more in their kind of natural habitats. And it's just about that kind of increased density of those individuals as well due to urbanization. Another thing is climate change, both at the habitat level, but also at the individual level for these species. So at a habitat level, climate change is having a really big impact on habitat quality and suitability for a lot of these species. Especially when we're starting to see really major temperature fluctuations and changes, especially in the winter. Turtles hibernate or brumate in wetlands and need to be under the ice and snow and in the water in order to survive. And when we start to see a lot of these like freeze thaw events before these turtles naturally would be ready to come out of brumation, it can really mess with their physical health as well, and sometimes cause other adverse effects like sometimes death, especially sometimes turtles are getting up and out and stuck on the ice because of these dramatic changes. A lot more frequently having drought conditions, also having more flood conditions, all of these really impacting the habitat and the places that these turtles can be. But also at an individual level, turtles are ectotherms or cold-blooded, and so these temperature changes can really affect their individual and physical health as well. So all things to kind of just added things on top of that list of threats that they are facing right now. And then one that is a little less known, but still super important to acknowledge, is illegal collection. And a lot of turtles are very susceptible to what we call poaching, but for specifically for the pet trade. And so, you know, just as if a turtle was to be hit by a car on a road and die, taking an individual out of a population can have really dramatic effects on their population growth and persistence, and being able to have those kind of older, bigger females out in the wild to be able to replenish that population. Every time you keep taking individuals out, it's going to just be harder and harder and harder for those populations to be able to respond and rebound. So just a few examples. This isn't everything. The list is quite long about all the threats that turtles have to face, but just kind of setting the stage for those kind of big ones that are especially present here in the GTA and in very urban areas. So as mentioned, all 8 species are federally and provincially listed as species at risk. You can kind of see them here. You might have noticed that there's maybe 9 turtles on here and not 8. And that's because our painted turtles we have here in Ontario, we actually have 2 distinct subspecies. We have the Midland painted turtle and the Western painted turtle. And at the federal level, the Midland painted turtle is also listed as a special concern on that species at risk list, but has not yet been reassessed provincially. So there's some discrepancies here, but both designating bodies for the species at risk in Ontario and in Canada have acknowledged that these species are imperiled, and there is a need for their protection and preservation. And as mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about the Blanding's turtle today. So let's get into that. So the Blanding's turtle is a very very distinct turtle here in Ontario. It's identified by a few kind of key traits. It has a very high domed, typically black or brownish top shell or carapace that has yellowish flecks. Sometimes they do look like spots, but they're not quite distinct spots like some other species we have, like the spotted turtle, but more like these flecks on the top of their shell, and very unique to kind of each individual turtle. We often say they have a high dome shell. A lot of people refer to them as looking like a military helmet in that high dome, and then like that tiny bit kind of a flare around the outside of their top shell. They're about a medium-sized turtle, so an adult is typically about 12 to 18 centimeters long. And again, that there's variation on either end of that scale. But comparative to our largest species in Ontario, the snapping turtle, they are quite a bit smaller, but they kind of fall into that middle range in terms of turtles, sizes of turtles that we have here in Ontario. Most distinctly, they're defined kind of by their bright yellow chin and throat. It's solid yellow and is very important characteristic for them. We'll talk about that again in a moment here. They also have something really cool on their bottom shell or their plastron. They have a hinge, which gives them just that little bit of an edge in terms of being able to use their muscles and cartilage and all those kind of things in order to actually close up the front of their shell, kind of like a clam. And that just gives them a little extra protection. These species are often referred to as the wanderers. They spend a lot more time on land than maybe some of our other species. They travel really far in order to find suitable nesting habitat, in order to find mates to move from wetland to wetland, whether in an urban setting or in a more kind of natural, undisturbed habitat. So having that trait in order to be able to kind of close themselves up just gives them that little bit added protection from predators or things that may want to eat them. Other species that you may know about that do it really well are the box turtles. They're able to actually close up the front and back of their shells in order to kind of just be like a little lump of a rock on the ground, which has proved very helpful for them. And same thing for the Blanding's turtles. They just can only do that front part. And often we're always asked, how do you tell the difference between a male or a female Blanding's turtle? And it's not the same for all turtle species. So this is quite distinct for the Blanding's turtles and also for wood turtles. But the males have what we call concave plastron. So their plastron has a little bit of a dip in it, where females' plastrons are flat. And that's because they have a high dome shell. They need to be well suited for reproduction and for mating. And so the males have that concave plastron, so they fit nicely on top. Another thing too is for most turtle species, if you look at, they have what we call cloaca, which is what I like to call one hole that does it all. For reptiles, most birds as well. The cloaca serves as a place for them to expel their waste, for reproduction, often holds their reproductive organs. If it's a female, it's where they lay their eggs. And often you can also, a little bit more invasive in terms of having to really look at that turtle, but you can look at the position of their cloaca. So typically the further down it is in relation to the base of their tail, it is male. The closer to the base of their tail, it's female. And again, all for those reproductive reasons. And males tend to have thicker base of their tails than females, and that's kind of consistent for most of our turtle species. These turtles are found in wetland habitats in kind of south central Ontario. So this is a very general map of kind of where they can be found, but they can be found almost consistently, or should naturally be found consistently across kind of all wetland habitats within that kind of south of like Sault Ste. Marie and around, and Manitoulin Island, and then down all the way into southern Ontario, and range all across the southern Great Lakes region, with distinct populations actually living in Nova Scotia, and then even all the way down into the United States with these kind of what we call disjunct, so not connected to that kind of main population, down in as far as into the States, into Nebraska. As mentioned earlier, turtles are very long living. The Blandings turtle is no exception to that. They live upwards of 80 years or older. There's been confirmed individuals in populations that have been monitored for a significantly longer time than we've really been actively monitoring turtles here in Ontario or in Southern Ontario. And they've been able to confirm an individual to be at least 94 years old. So 80 is it's a pretty conservative estimate for how long these turtles can actually live, and that's an individual who's lived in the wild their whole life, and living in captivity can also adjust those values as well. And again, as mentioned, they're quite late maturing. Comparatively to most species in Ontario, they're almost kind of the latest maturing of these turtles, which is not helping in terms of their species, their at-risk status. So they're typically maturing anywhere from 14 to 20 years old, with about 18 years being the average. So you can see they've really adjusted their life history traits to live a really long time, but they kind of hold off on maturing with the idea for many of these turtle species as the older you are, the larger you are, the more eggs you can lay. And for turtles, especially the turtles we have here in Ontario, they don't reach, as far as we know, an age where they are no longer reproductively, they can no longer reproduce. And so that really suits them, and historically has really suited them really well to live to a really long age, lay as many eggs as possible in order to spread their genetic material and their genetics within a population. However, with all these other threats that they're facing, that's no longer showing to be super productive for them as population levels and at the species level as well. They're just not able to kind of respond very quickly to these added stresses that they never had to deal with in the past. And to kind of get back to the importance of their bright yellow chin and throat, it is very characteristic of this species, so much so that many First Nations and Indigenous communities, especially here in Ontario, refer to the Blandings turtle as the turtle with the sun under its chin. Has very important cultural significance for many of these peoples, and has very important stories around the Blandings turtle as being that hero that was able to steal back the sun from tricksters who tried to take it away and lead to darkness, and so was given that bright yellow chin and throat as a sign of their courage and perseverance. So really, really kind of good sentiment to show that these turtles are meant and historically have really persevered on the landscape. And it's only now really that all these other human factors and human threats are coming into play that they're starting to really decline. So really just helps to reiterate that we probably should be playing a role in their preservation and in ensuring their protection on the landscape. So let's get a little bit more specific into the Rouge River watershed Blandings turtles, and specifically the ones that live within Rouge National Urban Park, which is just a small portion of the Rouge River watershed, but is one of the last locations that they're known to be within the Rouge River watershed. And this kind of sets us up for why we have this Headstarting project. And so over the past couple decades, really since the late 90s, it's been established that the population of Blandings turtles living within the Rouge River watershed and now within the Rouge River or Rouge National Urban Park, we're on the decline from kind of somewhat robust numbers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but the increasing threats of urbanization and roads and agriculture and all these other things have caused their decline over the past few decades, to the point where as of 2012, there was only about 7 known adults living within the park. and within the watershed as a whole. And when, thinking back to some of those life history traits that we were talking about, that just won't work in terms of these turtles being able to become or maintain a sustainable population. And they were deemed what we call functionally extinct. So there are still individuals living here, but if, no intervention occurs, they will no longer be here once these individuals pass away. And so based on that information and that knowledge, the Toronto Zoo, along with partners, including Friends of the Rouge River Watershed and now the Rouge National Urban Park, really worked to start this Blanding's turtle headstarting project as a long-term reintroduction project in order to rebuild this population. And they decided to do so through headstarting efforts, with the first headstarted turtles being released in 2014. So for those of you who have not already kind of know much about the project, headstarting, which is a fairly common conservation tool used for especially reptiles and species that don't really rely on parental care. So turtles, they come up out of the wetlands, they lay their eggs, and then they turn around and they leave, and often don't ever, see or interact with those individuals again, or really acknowledge kind of like any family relationships or family dynamics, unlike some other different species. And so it makes it a good species for working to like reestablish populations through these headstarting efforts, which is a method of subsidizing these small populations, which often involves the incubation of eggs, which are typically collected from the wild, but sometimes as part of breeding programs or projects. And then their subsequent captive care. So because they don't really need the parental care, we can give them the conditions that they need in order to grow and thrive. And then are raised often for a few years until they reach a larger body size in order to reduce their risk of being eaten or predated by predators out in the wild. And with the idea that typically the bigger is better, to an extent, where we don't want them in care for too long, that they become too reliant on humans and on us. But they're quite instinctful creatures and instinctful species. And so we raise them for a few years till they're just big enough where their risk of predation has decreased enough that we hope that their survival then increases significantly in the wild. So as I mentioned, kind of go through the process of headstarting a little bit. The main thing involves getting the individuals. And so for us at the Toronto Zoo, this involves collecting of eggs from the wild. When possible, which we've only been able to do twice in the history of the project, we collect eggs from females that live in the park. Very exciting. This past year, we were able to release headstarted individuals that came from one of our known females that we've been tracking since the early 2000s, on and off. We're able to reintroduce her offspring into the wild, or into the Rouge National Urban Park, which has been really great in order to kind of preserve some local genetics. But outside of those two instances that we've been able to do that, we collect eggs from other stable source populations that have been deemed that they can withstand the removal of some individuals from that population and still maintain their population levels and growth. And so we're not, damaging or affecting one population and trying to recover another. It's kind of just used as that supplementation. And so we've collected from different stable source populations over the years to hopefully preserve some genetic diversity within this population as well. And those eggs are typically collected in June. Historically, it was more late May, early June. As our kind of springs are starting to shift a little bit, it kind of shifted into June, and now we're maybe, some of the trends are suggesting kind of shifting back into that like late May, last week of May, first week of June. But typically it's those first few weeks of June that we collect those eggs, and that the turtles are kind of up and starting to nest. Once those eggs are collected, We bring them back to the Toronto Zoo where they're incubated. You can actually, if you visit the zoo, you can see them on display at the Americas Pavilion, where the eggs are set up in incubators. And they're constantly monitored. The moisture levels are maintained. They're incubated. The eggs we collect from each individual female, which is called a clutch. We separate those into two distinct groups at kind of a 60-40 ratio, as our goal is to have about 60% females, 40% males, which is easy for us to do because turtles, Blanding's turtles, not all turtle species, but Blanding's turtles and most species in Ontario have what we call temperature-dependent sex determination, which means the temperature which they're incubated at then determines their sex. And it's at a very particular point within their gestation period for Blanding's turtles. And so typically it's the warmer they're incubated at, they are going to result in females. The cooler they're incubated at going to result in males. And naturally out in the wild, that would mean the eggs that are typically laid first at the bottom of the nest where it's a little bit cooler, less direct heat from the sun, a little bit more moisture would be males. And as you kind of move your way up into the nest where you have more kind of consistently warmer, they would be females. And our goal at maintaining a 60-40 sex ratio is that females typically tend to have higher mortality rates in adulthood due to having to get up and cross roads and leave the wetlands in order to find places to lay their eggs. And so that's kind of what helps support that sex ratio. But also when you're trying to recover a species, for almost any species, having more females than males is often key. So both of the reasons are why we have those different sex ratios. And typically takes about 60 to 80 days for these turtles to hatch. In our care at the Toronto Zoo, it's more on the 60-day range. They're in kind of these pristine conditions where moisture and humidity and all those kind of things are maintained, and they're regularly monitored. So they tend to hatch a little bit more quickly. So we tend to see hatching around the beginning of August. But out in the wild, you'd probably start to see turtles hatching in kind of late August, September, and sometimes even later than that. And then once they hatch, we keep them in our care for about 2 years. And in their first year, they're able to be seen in the Americas Pavilion. And then we move them over to the Wildlife Health Center at the Toronto Zoo for their second year, where they then, prior to release, undergo kind of what we call a little bit of a turtle boot camp, where they are set up in outdoor enclosures in order to have a little bit more exposure to sunlight and rain and temperature changes, but all in a very controlled environment, closed, so there's no risk of predators getting in there. And so they can kind of, be a little bit more equipped for the wild. So we do that about a month and a half before they are ready to be released, which we do in June each year into various wetland habitats within the Rouge National Urban Park. And it's not quite enough for us just to dump a bunch of turtles out in the wild and hope for the best. In order to really know if what we're doing is right and if it's working, we have to monitor those species and those individuals, monitor the species and the individuals. And we do so typically through radio telemetry, which we'll see a little video about in a moment, which kind of describes that a little bit better. And then also through other things like just being out in the wetlands, doing what we call visual encounter surveys. So just spending time out there looking for individuals, especially as they get older, they start to bask up on logs and up in the sun a little bit more often. So we're able to kind of see if those individuals are surviving long term, but then also tracking them at a more regular frequency with these radio telemetry equipment over their first couple years of their life, just to kind of see if they're surviving and thriving. And then we also sometimes do some things like trapping and things like that, especially in places that we don't spend as much time, in order to see if those individuals are still in the area. So that is like a very, very quick, broad overview of the Headstarting project. And following this, I have a couple videos that'll be nice to kind of see how we prep the turtles for release and then how we monitor them as well. So you're not just listening to me talk the entire time. But really our goal for this project is to release at least 50 two-year-old turtles, Blanding's turtles, every year for about 20 years, 20 to 25 years, to reach a target population size of 100 to 150 adults by the year 2040. So initially, when this project was started, they did a bunch of population modeling and predicting and using values that they think they would predicted values for things like mortality, survival, age of first reproduction, like all those kind of things. And then this was the original kind of goal that was shown, that based on the available habitat and minimum head starting goals, that this is what could be an attainable, sustainable population that would be able to be maintained long term. So we will, like I said, let's watch a quick little video that kind of just shows a little bit of what we do in order to prep these turtles for release. And it'll just be a few minutes. And if you can't hear anything, please just yell out and let me know.
Each year, the Toronto Zoo releases endangered Blanding's turtles into the Rouge National Urban Park. These 2-year-old turtles have been in our care since hatching as part of our Head Start program. The juveniles live in a special, controlled environment in the zoo's Wildlife Health Center for the 2nd year of life, as we prepare them for life in the wild. But what happens to get them ready for their big release? While in our care, each Blanding's turtle is weighed and measured every month so that we can track their growth. And we'll continue to do this as we follow up with them after they're released into the wild. We first weigh them on the scale, and at this age, they are approximately 175 grams. We then take shell measurements of both the width and the length of their carapace, or upper shell. We also measure the plastron, or the lower shell, and the height of the turtle's shell. All of this information gets recorded and inputted into a master database. Before they are released, each of the turtles will get a unique combination of notches put onto the outside of their shell. These are called the marginal scutes, and because they're part of the shell, the outer layer is made of keratin, which is the same protein that our hair and our fingernails are made of. So as we make these marks on their shell, it does not hurt the turtle, but it will stay with them as they grow and act as a sort of name that we can use to tell who is who after they're released. Each turtle has 12 marginal scutes on each side of their shell. And a really interesting fact is that some Indigenous people use the turtle shell as a calendar. Before release, a pit tag, about the size of a grain of rice, is carefully injected into the turtle's leg. The pit tag is very similar to a microchip that a dog or a cat would get. The skin of each turtle is disinfected before injection, and then the chip is quickly inserted into the turtle's back leg. The insertion site of each turtle is quickly sealed, and a final check is done using the pit tag reader to ensure that it is tracking as it should be. Once complete, the turtles are returned to their tank and ready to be released.
Okay, perfect. So just to kind of tie that back together a little bit, the notching that we do for these turtles is super important, especially for the individuals that we don't, that we're not actively tracking. Something that the video didn't show is that, yeah, we put these radiotelemetry tags on a subset of individuals each year, which this video will highlight a little bit more about why. And so that gives them kind of a means of identification for those individuals that we're not actively tracking, having some sort of identification. So if we are to come across them again out in the wild, we can know who they are when they were born. Is really, really important for us to understand survival at specific ages, and also to know if that individual is one that has been head started and been part of our project, or if that maybe is a wild individual that we didn't know about. So that's the really kind of important part of the identification, being able to identify individuals. And the nice thing about the having the pit tags as well is if it's one, for example, sometimes their damage can happen to turtle shells, or sometimes because they've grown a lot more faster as they're younger. Sometimes as they grow, the notches tend to shift a little bit. And so having more than one way to try and identify an individual is super helpful. And also sometimes the pit tags aren't able to be read after for whatever reason, something's happened there. And so having that kind of alternative way to identify them is super important. But again, let's jump into this very quick little video just to show about how we track these individuals, because it's much nicer to see it than me try to explain it.
Hi, I'm Christine and I'm with Adopt-A-Pond, and we're here in the Rouge National Urban Park tracking Blanding's turtles. So Nash here has radio telemetry gear that he's using to tune in to little transmitters that are attached to the back of Blanding's turtles that are head starts that we released here. So the turtles have a little transmitter attached to the back of their shell, and we tune in to their specific radio frequency using this receiver, which is attached to an antenna, which amplifies the signal in order for us to find the turtles. So we pinpoint these turtles and we take down their location info, any sort of habitat descriptions like the vegetation that's surrounding us, as well as if they're in the water, on land, submerged, their behavior, any sort of information that indicates their location and kind of what they're doing in this point in time. It can later help us with overwintering habitat, which habitats they're using throughout the wetland, and lots of important information to suggest how they're doing after we have released them. As well, once a month, we catch these turtles and we take measurements, including their weight and measurements of the lengths of their shells to see how well they're growing over time, as well as checking in for any sort of secondary sex characteristics to see once they reached a point of time of maturity. Right now, our turtles, this will be our 10th year releases this year. So our turtles will be upwards of 12 years. But a lot of Blanding's turtles, the females in particular, do not sexually mature until 18 to 25 years of age. So we still have many years, but we will be working and watching over time to see when these juveniles become adults.
Perfect. Okay. So again, just kind of to bring that back together, is that this monitoring is essential for one to know if these turtles are surviving, if our project is being successful, to identify the habitats that they're using. So to kind of know which types of habitats they like or they choose, in order for which ones maybe we need to further protect or further enhance or restore, or how to create similar habitat in other parts of the park. That the turtles, we could release them into in other locations that they would be able to use to thrive. And another big thing is collecting all this information, which we often call demographic data, especially the ones about survival and when they're reaching sexual maturity, is all super important for us when we do population modeling, in order to kind of do some kind of check-ins as this project goes, to see how we're doing and how we can, how based on the information we do know, what is predicted for this population long term. So the more data that we have related to survival in age of first reproduction and potential predation events and things like that are all super key for us to continue this modeling and be able to adapt and change our management and headstarting methods in order to ensure the long-term preservation of these this population. And so some kind of fun good news is that to date we've released over around 490 Blanding's turtles into the park as head-started individuals. And in addition to that, we've released about 240 hatchlings as well. So turtles that have been incubated and hatched at the Toronto Zoo, but not head-started. We unfortunately have a little bit of a lower capacity right now where we can keep maximum of 60 individuals to Head Start for 2 years, but we often collect a little bit more than that through when we're doing egg collection in order to have a few more individuals just in case something happens and we have less than ideal numbers for headstarting. So anything excess of that 60 that we do have, we release as hatchlings. And good news, we've actually been able to find a couple of them that have survived in the park due to that being able to identify them through notches, which has been really exciting. So I'm running really low on time here, and I want to still have some time for questions. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a okay, we said 10 years, that video is a couple years old now, but we're at about year 12 of this project and of releases. So what have we learned so far? The big thing is that population has increased from approximately 10 individuals, so 7. We had a couple juvenile turtles that were found in the past that have now been confirmed to be adults. So population is as of like 2014 was more about 10. To 269 individuals as of our last population modeling, which incorporated data up until 2022. So we've been able to have a pretty big increase on this population, with none of them reaching sexual maturity yet, but the potential for that very soon. Our juvenile survival is predicted to be high, which is really exciting, and much higher than sometimes some other populations as well, with the exception of a couple instances where we've had some things we call mass mortality events, which typically predator induced. So on average, with those kind of couple instances as an set as kind of outliers as an exception, we have fairly high juvenile survival. Our head starts are overwintering successfully from the best of our knowledge. We're finding these individuals year after year. Their health is similar to wild-born individuals when looking at their growth rates and their size and mass, which is exciting. The most recent population modeling, we call it a population viability analysis, projects that we will meet our population goal of about 100 adults. I think it was like 104 adults by the year 2043. And that's based on just some values that we've predicted, some stuff that we know for survival. And that's betting on none of that changing, us not changing head starting methods, the other risks not changing as well. So that's a very fluid prediction, but is nice to see that we are on track at the bare minimum, potentially to make that, to reach that goal, which is exciting. Juvenile survivor rates are, this population modeling also showed that these juvenile survival rates will have the largest influence on population persistence and growth, which is a little different than some populations. As I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of turtles rely on living to really old age in order to reproduce and spread their genetics within a population. And most populations do rely on that. But for this population, because there's virtually no adults in the grand kind of scheme of everything, it really is fully reliant on these juveniles surviving and reaching maturity. So super important that we maintain or even increase survival rates of these individuals. And at the end of our presentations, we always like to do a little bit of what can you do to help. Many of you probably know this already, but give turtles a break. Turtles are always going to be on the roads, and roads are always going to be a threat to them. So the more we can do to help mitigate that, the better. So slow down when you're through wetland areas and help them cross the roads whenever it's safe to do so. We have lots of videos on how you can do that. Become a community scientist and report your turtle sightings, which you can actually do right through Adopt a Pond in the Toronto Zoo, but also through other partners and organizations that have community science projects. Help restore and protect turtle habitat in your communities, become parts of organizations like the Toronto Field Naturalist Club and other groups that do this kind of work, but also just be an advocate for wetland protection in your neighborhoods. Always leave the wild in the wild. Don't remove turtles from their natural habitats. Support conservation groups and organizations. Most of the work that we do for this project is actually grant funded, and so really relies on the support from community and from other organizations financially, specifically, to be able to do so. And almost all conservation groups in Ontario are in a similar boat. And then also just continue to learn and share what you know. A lot of people don't protect or don't care as much about the things that they don't know. So the more that we share the importance of turtles, wetlands, and the role that they play is essential in order for their long-term protection. And as I mentioned, we have really great community science projects that you guys can all be a part of. For those who aren't already part of them, we have the projects called Ontario Turtle Tally and Frog Watch Ontario, which we administer through the iNaturalist platform. So if you're already participating in an iNaturalist, you can join our projects. And if not, I recommend you check out our website for some more information on how you can become involved with those projects and help support reptile and amphibian conservation here in Ontario. Okay, thank you so much. I definitely went a little bit over. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you to our partners that help us do all the work that we're doing. And I'm still available for questions if there is time permitting.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I appreciate that. That was a really good presentation. I had a whole bunch of questions, and you answered like most of them in that little roundup at the end. I just have one quick one, and then there's a bunch in the chat here.
Yep.
The question I had was about the when you're sourcing the eggs and then you're monitoring them as the head started turtles grow. You said their survival rate is about equal to the wild population.
It's actually, their survival rate is actually higher than most wild populations that we know. And that is partly we think to do with the fact that our juveniles are about the size of a 4 to 6 year old turtle when they're being released. In comparison, because they've had that kind of extended time and care to be able to grow and to have a larger body size. And so I think that really is giving them that head start and that little bit of a leg up, which is helping kind of keep a higher survival rate than I think a lot of juveniles, where most of the time juveniles are defined as age 2 to, age 10, and then like subadults after that. So it is typically, it's a little bit higher than most populations, which is exciting.
Cool. Okay, good. That helps. Okay, so I got a bunch of questions. The first one is from Eugene, and he's asking about wood turtle. Is there a wood turtle head starting program?
So there are some projects that are happening to conserve wood turtles in a similar way that the Toronto Zoo does have some involvement in. But yeah, that's kind of as much as we can say, because wood turtles are highly susceptible to poaching for the pet trade. For some of the populations in Ontario, that's the full reason why they are actually endangered, is because of the removal of these individuals from the wild. So we don't share too much information on that for their overall protection. But yes, there are some projects happening to conserve wood turtles, and the Toronto Zoo is involved in some of those things.
The second half of his question was, is there someone you can contact to make a contribution to that program?
Potentially. Yes, maybe just send if you want to email Adopt a Pond. So our email is aap@torontozoo.ca, and maybe just give us a little bit more information on kind of what you're looking for from that, and we'll see what maybe we can do for that.
All right, thanks, Rachel. The next question was, I guess, looking at the slide of all the various species. Just a question from Barbara. What about red-eared turtles?
Yeah, red-eared sliders are a turtle species that's found here in Ontario, but they're actually not a native species to Ontario. They're a non-native, potentially invasive species that occurs here, which are pet turtles. They're you go to the pet store and you see a turtle for $45 or $20 or whatever it is. And they're not naturally occurring here in Ontario. They naturally occur a little bit more down in the States, down the kind of east coast of the United States down into Florida. And historically, I think a lot of people get pets and gets turtles as pets and don't really understand the major commitment. These turtles also live upwards of 60, 70, 80 years old. And so a lot of people don't understand or can't maybe care for those turtles in a proper way and then release them into the wild. And so now they are becoming much more common, potentially causing risks and threats to our native species as well, in terms of the spread of disease, using essential habitat, especially basking habitat, competing our other species. But a lot of that's still unknown. But yeah, it's so not one of the species that we're worried about in terms of on the species at risk list, because they're a non-native species here in Ontario. So in terms of leave the wild in the wild, also don't release pets into the wild to help protect your native species.
Got it. All right. I got a couple from Karen, so I'm going to combine the two.
Sure.
The first comment she made was she might have missed how we find and collect the eggs, and then related to that, she said there was a turtle crossing sign near where she lives in Aurelia, and when the neighbors see the hatching sites, they put cages over the nesting. So is that
Yes.
part of how you find them?
Yeah. So kind of. So for our particular purpose, for egg collection, we collect from a stable source population. We do collect from areas that are more kind of at risk of those eggs maybe not being able to survive. So from roadsides, agricultural fields, things like that. In our case, the population that we collect from is quite robust. So what we do is we go out at night or go out in the evenings, drive really slowly around these areas that we know these turtles occur, and watch for them to come up and start nesting on the roads. We mark the location where they've started nesting. It takes a really long time for turtles to nest. And so we let them kind of do their thing, sometimes even for a couple hours. And then we come back to that kind of marked area and look for that nest. Sometimes the female is still there covering up the nest. Sometimes she's gone and all you can kind of see is like a little wet patch on the ground. And so those are the kind of things we're looking for in order to get our eggs. And because the area we're going in has quite a robust population, it's not too hard for us to be able to find those because we're out there kind of at the times after like a nice rain, first few weeks of July, when the temperatures are kind of most ideal for them in order to get those eggs. Sometimes it takes us a couple nights, but then additionally, yes, protecting turtle nests is really important. Less than 1% of turtle eggs that are laid survive to be mature adults. And so again, because of those big stresses, because of a lot of predators. And so protecting those nests with those kind of cages, they're typically like 2x4s or pieces of wood with metal mesh on top, typically something stronger than chicken wire, because a lot of things can eat through the chicken wire, that have little like notches cut out of the sides. So when the turtles hatch, they can get out. Just gives them that little bit more protection from being dug up. It's not foolproof, but it is a great way to help mitigate the impacts of predators. And in Rouge National Urban Park, you might see some of those cages and things like that because there is actively a work happening, especially with the Parks Canada staff, in order to protect nests throughout the park for those that aren't able to be excavated and incubated. So yes, very, very important thing to be doing in order to maintain hatchling and survival. But yeah, for us, for our particular egg collection, the way that we do it right now, we kind of collect from a very particular area to ensure that we're not having any negative impacts on other populations as well.
All right. Thanks, Rachel.
Mhm.
Philip's question is, how do you ensure genetic diversity in the Head Start population?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of those things is that right now, could we collect from stable source populations? It hasn't always been the same population. And so we have been collecting from different populations over the years and getting eggs from other places in Ontario, which has been really pivotal in that. But yeah, with something that we're kind of starting to look into to see if that has been enough to maintain kind of genetic diversity, especially once we start to see those individuals start reproducing. So we've kind of made some assumptions and that is good enough and that will work in terms of preserving genetic diversity. But yeah, it's still something that in order to like fully confirm if that has worked and if we've done that with something, we still kind of have to investigate as they're starting to get a little bit older. But yeah, that's our goal, is to try and spread it out a little bit, and not always collect from one population or from the same set of females every year.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Corinne, I'm not sure which, is asking, does the project use traditional Indigenous knowledge along with Western science?
Absolutely. A big part of that is for actually our egg collection methods, or egg collection as well, in the areas where we collect eggs. A lot of it is within traditional territories, and a lot of that location of those areas have been supported by the Indigenous communities of the area as well. Another really wonderful thing that I've learned fairly recently is that for things like knowing when to go and collect eggs, is that typically turtles come out when the daisies start to bloom. And so that gives us like a really fun indication, a good indication of when that we're kind of there at the right time. And a lot of that is supported by that kind of traditional ecological knowledge as well. Additionally, a lot of the work that we do is supported and done kind of which is somewhat of a new thing that is starting, but through the oh gosh, I can't remember I'm trying to think of the particular name and I'm getting it all mixed up in my head. But the First Nations advisory circles that we have one along with the Toronto Zoo and Parks Canada as well, that help give us feedback and support for these projects, and also taking a lot of that Indigenous knowledge into play when looking at things like landscape level management and how what we're doing affects other species and biodiversity, and then making sure we're keeping that in mind and that traditional ecological knowledge as well in mind as we do what we do.
Cool. All right, thank you. Michelle had a question about the females. How far do females range in the course of a year or 2 years? Do they stay in one place, or do they migrate a lot?
They move a lot. And I can't remember, I give these presentations all the time. I can't remember if I mentioned this, but Blanding's turtles are typically known as the wanderers. And the females are really the ones that hold that true. They've been seen to travel upwards of 5 kilometers, if not more, in 1 year or 1 season for various life activities that they do, from moving from foraging locations to hibernation or brumation sites, to find a nest, to find mates. And so, yeah, maintaining these really like big interconnected, uninterrupted habitats for Blanding's turtles is really key, which really, does make them a good kind of indicator species for a healthy habitat, is that if it has all the things that a Blanding's turtle really needs to survive, because they do rely on those upland habitats, those forested areas to migrate through, the interconnected waterways to move through, that it really helps us kind of know that we have a more healthy habitat, because they're one of those few species that really like fully rely on all those different aspects of a wetland and forest ecosystems for all aspects of their life. So yes, they move a lot.
That's good. And you almost answered the next question, I guess. Much the same, well, related. A question for Christian was about the correlation between recaptured individuals and the nearby plant species and vegetation. I think that's what you were just describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is something that when we're monitoring the individuals, we do keep an eye out for kind of what type of habitats they're living in, specifically the types of vegetation that are there, and which maybe that they're maybe choosing more to be in. So then we can know that if, we're planning a new area for restoration, and I say we, but at the kind of Parks Canada level, that, we're well informed on the types of things that these turtles in this particular area are using. But also kind of keeping an eye out for things like invasive species that are becoming much more prevalent, especially Phragmites, which is a tall invasive wetland plant that could potentially be kind of disrupting the quality of those wetland habitats because of its density, and it's kind of choking out of those native species. So yes, we're definitely keeping a close eye on how all of that is interconnected. And then, again, not just the wetland plants, but also those upland plants and areas around them, and ensuring that the habitat is suitable for the turtles to be able to move and go where they need to go.
Great.
Yep.
And then kind of leading on from that, Rick has a question. He's interested in the methods used to recapture the turtles once they're in the wild.
In their water. It's not super high tech, honestly. It's we use the radio telemetry to get to that turtle, typically because they have a radio telemetry transmitter, which has an antenna. We're getting that beep that they kind of described in that video. There's a beep that we're tuning into. The closer or more honed into that frequency we are, the louder the beeps are, and that lets us get kind of a directionality in order to find those turtles. And so once we kind of we've narrowed that frequency range down, and we still getting a really loud beep, that gives us an indication that that turtle is within, a couple feet or whatever, a small area in front of us. And we just kind of stick our hands in and start moving around and try and find that turtle. We try to avoid doing that as much as possible, so we're not kind of disrupting those turtles more than needed. So it's when they're kind of ready for their monthly measurements, that's when we kind of really get in there and try to recapture those turtles. But yeah, it's not super high tech. It's definitely not foolproof. Sometimes we just try really hard and we can't recapture those individuals, even though we know maybe where they are. But yeah, it's that sometimes, and sometimes we've tried nets and things like that, but nothing's as good as just unfortunately sticking your hand into the wetland and trying to find that turtle, which you do get used to. It sounds very daunting and scary. And it is when you kind of start doing it at first, and then you realize that there's really nothing that big and scary in there that you have to worry about. So yeah.
I'm laughing because you're describing some of my childhood.
Yeah.
Time in the swamps and ponds around when I was growing.
Absolutely.
One last question I've got here is from Anna Louise. She's asking about their best food in the wild. What do they eat?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of in the park, that's actually something that we've been talking about, that we have some, ideas of the things that they eat, but we don't know for sure in terms of like using that as an indicator of whether a site is a good place for these turtles to go. But in general, Blanding's turtles have pretty diverse diets. Turtles, almost all turtle species in Ontario are omnivore, so they eat both plants and meat. The duckweed, which is that little kind of floating, looks like a lily pad, but it's like teeny tiny, that floats around on the top of the water. Blanding's turtles tend to really love that, and eat a lot of vegetation. They're also scavengers, and so they like to eat a lot of dead things. So they'll be going around and eating a lot of dead fish, live and dead fish. They like to eat a lot of amphibians and frogs. Seen lots of the juveniles eating tadpoles and things like that as well. And they also do sometimes like kind of the more crunchy things, so like small snails and different kind of little crustaceans and things, and worms. And as they get older and bigger, the kind of bigger things that they do start to try and eat. And when they're in care in the zoo, we try to mimic that as best as possible. So we feed them worms, they get smelts, they also get crickets, which is kind of something which is they may be eating out in the wild, but they've been fed really well, so they're called what we call gut loaded. So they've got as much nutrients as possible, and also just gives them something to kind of learn how to hunt and chase for as well. And then also lettuce and kale and other turtle, we call it turtle gel, but it's basically a supplement of different meat materials and vitamins and nutrients that they can get, especially all the extra calcium they may not be getting from eating like other and live animals out in the wild. So yeah, that's a diverse amount of things. And for turtles too, a little unique from some other species is that they will actually eat on land as well, because they do spend a lot of time on land. So sometimes you'll see them munching on like little flowers or mushrooms or things like that as well.
So presumably there's a little bit of work for them when they're in the boot camp to find their food?
Absolutely. We try a little bit. There's only so much you can do, because we also want to make sure, for us also, growth and being healthy is super important as well. So we want to make sure that we're spreading the wealth across all the turtles and the tanks and things like that. So there is a little bit of, a balance between that and being able to provide them with some kind of, like boot camp training for things that they eat in the wild. But just anecdotally, they're very instinctful. And we haven't really, seen any major issues or red flags in terms of them not being able to forage effectively in the wild. They seem to pick it up super quickly, even just with the little bit of extra help we can do for them in care.
Great. Okay, that's it for the questions. There was one last comment from Karen about your description of the cages. That is what she has seen.
Perfect.
She hasn't been able to see the laying or the hatching at this point, so I guess she needs to watch for the flowering of the daisies at the right time.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rachelle. That was really good. Rachel, I appreciate the presentation and the answers to all the questions. It was really good. A few people are chiming in to say thank you.
Perfect.
Ellen, is there, excuse me. I think I have one last thing to do, which is Just to remind everybody that there is the next talk coming up in March. Love to see you there. But again, thank you everyone for being here today. And again, thank you, Rachel, for filling us in on the world of the turtles. Ellen, was there anything you wanted to add at this point, or
That was it. Thank you so much, Rachel. It was a delight, and we wish you all the best, and all the turtles as well. So.
No problem. Thank you so much. If anybody has any other questions, concerns, anything following this as well, you can also reach us at the Adopt a Pond email, which is aap@torontozoo.ca. Also, if you just Google Adopt a Pond, everything you could need is there. Any information about our programming and any contact information you may need is there as well. So please reach out if you have any questions.
Great. Thanks,
Awesome.
Rachel.
No problem. Thank you all, and have a great day. Happy World Wetland Day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.